April 12, 1945, 5:00 p.m. Washington, D.C. is drenched in a cold, relentless spring rain. Inside the Capitol building, Vice President Harry S. Truman is relaxing with a bourbon and water in Speaker Sam Rayburn's office, believing his day is effectively over. Then the phone rings. It is the White House. The voice on the other end is urgent, instructing him to come immediately to the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance, quietly. Truman assumes the president has returned early from Warm Springs, Georgia, perhaps for a routine briefing. He does not know that the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt has already ended. As his motorcade cuts through the wet streets, the city seems deceptively normal, but inside the executive mansion, the frantic machinery of a hidden government is grinding to a halt. Truman walks into Eleanor Roosevelt's study at 5:25 p.m. She places a hand on his shoulder and speaks the words that will shatter the world order. "Harry, the president is dead." In that second, the massive, labyrinthine structure of secret agreements, off-the-books alliances, and hidden atomic projects built by Roosevelt crashes down onto the shoulders of a man who was never meant to know they existed. To understand the terrifying silence that descended upon the cabinet room on that rainy evening, one must first understand the colossal machinery Franklin Delano Roosevelt had built over 12 years. By April 1945, the United States was not merely a republic governed by constitutional checks and balances. It was a global war machine forged entirely in the image of one man. Roosevelt had not just occupied the presidency, he had absorbed it. He was the commander-in-chief, the chief diplomat, and the spiritual father of the Allied coalition. On the surface, the war situation appeared to be a triumphant march toward victory. In Europe, the Third Reich was in its death throes. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's armies were sweeping across Germany, halting at the Elbe River while the Soviet Red Army prepared its final apocalyptic assault on Berlin. In the Pacific, the grind was slower and bloodier. Marines were fighting inch by inch on the black sands of Iwo Jima and the mud of Okinawa, but the trajectory was clear. The axis was breaking. However, beneath the military maps and the newsreel footage, the administrative reality of Washington was a labyrinth of secrets. Roosevelt did not govern through the traditional hierarchy. He viewed the official cabinet, the secretaries of state, labor, and commerce, as necessary window dressing, often filled with political appointees he intended to ignore. Real power resided in what observers called the Palace Guard, a shadow network of unofficial advisors, personal envoys, and loyalists who reported directly to the president's bedroom. At the center of this web was the map room. Established in the basement of the White House, strictly off-limits to most cabinet members and the vice president, this was the nerve center of the global conflict. Here, intelligence flowed directly from Churchill and Stalin to Roosevelt, bypassing the State Department entirely. The Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius Jr., was a handsome, silver-haired figurehead, often the last to know what American foreign policy actually was. The real diplomacy was conducted by men like Harry Hopkins, a frail, chain-smoking social worker who lived in the Lincoln bedroom and acted as Roosevelt's alter ego. Hopkins could commit the United States to billions of dollars in Lend-Lease aid or shift the borders of Poland over a dinner conversation in Moscow, all without a single sheet of official paper being filed in the State Department archives. This system of personalized rule extended to the military. Admiral William Leahy, the president's chief of staff, held more sway than the civilian secretaries. The Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., a neighbor and close friend of FDR, was allowed to draft foreign policy for Germany that directly contradicted the War Department. Roosevelt encouraged this chaos. He believed that by overlapping jurisdictions and keeping his subordinates fighting for his attention, he remained the ultimate arbiter. He held the codes, the promises to Stalin, and the atomic secrets in his own head. It was a brilliant system for a living titan, but it was a catastrophic legacy for a successor. By the spring of 1945, the cracks in this personalized system were widening. The agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February, where the fate of post-war Europe was decided, were largely verbal understandings between Roosevelt and Stalin based on mutual charm and personal trust. There were loose transcripts, but the spirit of the agreement relied entirely on Roosevelt's presence. He believed he could manage Uncle Joe. But as Roosevelt's health failed, the Soviet Union began to tighten its grip on Eastern Europe, violating the very pledges Roosevelt had made. The shadow government continued to function on autopilot, assuming the boss would fix it. They drafted memos he was too weak to read and planned summits he would never attend. When the president's heart stopped beating in Warm Springs, the brain of the Allied war effort effectively shut down. The files were scattered. The promises were unrecorded. The shadow government, men loyal to a ghost, remained in their offices, guarding secrets that were now critical to national survival. They viewed the vice presidency as a ceremonial retirement home for politicians who couldn't cause trouble. They had never considered what would happen if the boss died, and they certainly never anticipated having to explain the architecture of the modern world to the man from Missouri who was, until this moment, completely irrelevant. If Franklin Roosevelt was the majestic, enigmatic architect of the Allied war effort, Harry Truman was the man hired to sweep the floors, only to be handed the blueprints when the building was on fire. The contrast between the two men was not just a matter of style. It was a chasm of experience and access that threatened to swallow the American government whole. Truman had been vice president for exactly 82 days. In that time, he had met privately with Roosevelt only twice. The president, perhaps in denial of his own mortality or simply protective of his fiefdom, had made no effort to mentor his successor. There were no transition memos, no joint briefings, and no introductions to the secret channels that ran the war. Truman was an outsider in every sense, a former haberdasher and machine politician from Missouri who had made his name in the Senate investigating military waste, not shaping global strategy. When Truman stepped into the role on that rainy night, he was arguably the most uninformed commander-in-chief in American history. He did not know about the agreements made at Yalta regarding Poland and the Far East. He did not know the extent of the tensions with the Soviet Union. As the optimistic press releases from the White House painted a picture of harmonious brotherhood with Stalin, most critically, strictly forbidden from entering the map room, Truman was completely unaware that the United States was months away from testing a weapon capable of vaporizing a city. The Manhattan Project was a black hole in his understanding of the war. The Roosevelt cabinet viewed him with a mixture of pity and condescension. To men like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a patrician statesman who had served presidents since Taft, Truman was a little man, a political accident. The inner circle, the secret cabinet, assumed that the transition would be cosmetic. They believed Truman would serve as a figurehead, a rubber stamp for the policies and personnel Roosevelt had entrenched. They expected to continue running the government from their specific fiefdoms, managing the new president just as they had managed the bureaucracy under FDR. The atmosphere in the White House in the days following the funeral was ghostly. Truman, sensitive to the nation's grief, did not move into the living quarters immediately, leaving Alina time to pack. He worked out of the Oval Office surrounded by Roosevelt's ship models and naval prints, feeling like an intruder in a shrine. He told reporters, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." But beneath the humility was a steely, defensive rigidness. Truman sensed the condescension of the Roosevelt men. He knew they saw him as an interim leader. The danger of this dynamic was immediate. With the war in Europe ending, the Soviets were already testing the boundaries of the post-war order, moving troops into positions that violated the spirit of the alliance. Stalin, hearing of Roosevelt's death, likely viewed Truman as a weakling, a provincial bourgeois politician who could be bullied or ignored. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was frantic, sending cables that Truman initially struggled to interpret without the context of the previous years of correspondence. The machinery of the American government was still running on the momentum of a dead man. The shadow government was executing plans for a world that no longer existed. Truman had to decide, and quickly, whether to be the puppet they expected or to take an axe to the very structure that had won the war. He spent his nights reading diplomatic cables until his eyes blurred, trying to catch up on 4 years of history in a week. He realized rapidly that he wasn't just stepping into Roosevelt's shoes. He was stepping into a trap of conflicting promises and hidden agendas. The first and most terrifying angle of Truman's ignorance was revealed on April 25, 1945, 13 days after he took the oath. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a man of immense gravity who carried the demeanor of an Old Testament prophet, requested a private audience. He did not come alone. He brought with him Major General Leslie Groves, a man who had spent the war hiding entire cities in the American wilderness. For years, the shadow government had successfully concealed the Manhattan Project not just from the enemy, but from the United States Congress and the Vice President. Ironically, as a senator, Truman had sniffed around the massive expenditures at the Hanford site in Washington state, suspecting waste or corruption. At the time, Stimson had called him and curtly ordered him to stop the investigation for the sake of national security. Truman, respecting the chain of command, had backed off. Now, the reason for that order sat on the desk in the Oval Office. Stimson handed Truman a memorandum that began with words chilling in their simplicity. "Within 4 months, we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history." The revelation was physically staggering. Truman was told that the United States had built a secret industry, employing over 100,000 people, to construct a bomb that could destroy a city in a single flash. The moral and strategic implications were dumped onto Truman in a single afternoon. Roosevelt had lived with the slow development of the bomb for years, evolving his thinking alongside the technology. Truman was handed the trigger before he even understood the mechanism. He learned that the weapon was not merely an explosive, it was a diplomatic lever. Stimson explained that this S-1 project was the master key to the post-war world, the only thing that might balance the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Soviet Red Army in Europe. The shadow government had been banking on this weapon to solve the geopolitical riddles they couldn't solve with words. Truman realized he was not just inheriting a war. He was inheriting the power of a god, controlled by a military apparatus that had been operating with zero civilian oversight beyond the late president. Angle 2, the Soviet illusion and the Yalta axiom. While the atomic secret was a shock of the future, the diplomatic files revealed a shock of the present. Truman began to dig into the Yalta axiom, the core belief of Roosevelt's inner circle that the Soviet Union was a difficult but manageable partner. Men like Harry Hopkins and the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Joseph Davies, held a romanticized view of the alliance. They believed that Stalin's aggression was merely a defensive reaction to insecurity. They argued that if the United States offered enough loans, enough warmth, and enough territorial concessions, the Kremlin would relax and cooperate. This was the operating system of the shadow government: charm Stalin, and the peace is secured. But when Truman finally gained access to the raw cables from the map room, the unvarnished reports that didn't make it into the optimistic press releases, he saw a completely different reality. The spirit of Yalta was a fiction. The cables from W. Averell Harriman, the ambassador in Moscow, painted a grim picture. While Roosevelt's envoys were toasting vodka in the Kremlin, the Soviet secret police, NKVD, were systematically arresting the leaders of the Polish resistance, men the Allies had promised to protect. The Soviets were installing puppet governments in Romania and Bulgaria, blatantly violating the declaration on liberated Europe signed only weeks prior. The shadow government had been filtering this information, shielding the dying Roosevelt from the failure of his grand design, or perhaps deluding themselves. Truman, a man of facts and ledgers, looked at the discrepancy between the Roosevelt policy and the Soviet actions. He saw no misunderstanding. He saw a breach of contract. The old hands in the State Department urged him to be patient, to write polite letters, to maintain the illusion of unity at all costs. They treated the Soviet Union like a temperamental relative. Truman, reading the reports of disappearances and betrayals, began to view them as a rival syndicate breaking a deal. The friction between the new president and Roosevelt's pro-Soviet advisors began to generate sparks immediately. The advisors wanted continuity, Truman wanted accountability. If the atomic bomb was the hidden weapon, Harry Hopkins was the hidden operator. To Truman, Hopkins was the personification of the shadow government. He held no official cabinet rank, yet during the Roosevelt years, he was more powerful than any secretary. A frail, chain-smoking former social worker who looked perpetually on the verge of death, Hopkins had lived in the White House for years, occupying the Lincoln bedroom like a permanent squatter. He was Roosevelt's legs, his ears, and often his voice. Hopkins operated on intuition and personal relationships, bypassing the clumsy bureaucracy of the State Department. He had forged the personal link with Churchill and Stalin. When Truman arrived, Hopkins was physically disintegrating, ravaged by stomach cancer, yet he still held the keys to the diplomatic kingdom. He was the only man who knew exactly what had been said in private rooms in Tehran and Yalta. For Truman, Hopkins was a dilemma. He represented the disorganized, personalized style of government that Truman detested, a system where power depended on proximity to the bedroom rather than constitutional authority. Yet Truman needed him. In the first weeks, Truman had to humble himself, sitting by the bedside of the dying man, extracting memories and secrets like a historian interviewing a ghost. Hopkins was loyal, but he was a relic. His presence in the White House was a constant reminder that Truman was living in a borrowed house, operating a machine built for another man's hands. To establish his own presidency, Truman knew he would eventually have to exorcise the ghost, no matter how helpful he was. Angle 4. The Morgenthau Plan. The final angle of chaos was the vengeance fantasy festering in the Treasury Department. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary and close friend, had convinced FDR to sign off on a radical post-war vision, the Morgenthau Plan. This proposal aimed to strip Germany of all heavy industry, flood its mines, and reduce the industrial heart of Europe into a pastoral, agricultural state. It was a plan born of righteous anger against Nazi atrocities, but strategically, it was a disaster. The War Department and the British were horrified. They argued that a starving, deindustrialized Germany would become a breeding ground for communism and a permanent drain on American resources. Yet, because Morgenthau was part of the Palace Guard, his plan had become the de facto policy, lingering in the memos and directives Truman inherited. Truman, a pragmatist who studied history, recognized the danger immediately. He saw that the Morgenthau Plan was a repeat of the mistakes of Versailles, vengeance that would seed the next war. But erasing it wasn't simple. Morgenthau was a Roosevelt untouchable. To strike down the plan was to strike at the memory of the fallen leader. Truman found himself presiding over a government at war with itself, where the Treasury was dictating military occupation policy and the army was trying to rebuild nations. The Secret Cabinet wasn't just hiding information, it was actively driving the world toward a chaotic vacuum in Central Europe. Truman realized he couldn't just tweak the settings, he had to shut the engine down. The simmering tension between the dead president's shadow government and the living president came to a violent boil on the afternoon of April 23, 1945. The catalyst was the arrival of Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov in Washington. For days, the Roosevelt loyalists had been whispering in Truman's ear, urging caution. Joseph Davies, a key figure in the old Palace Guard and a devoted Russophile, implored Truman not to offend Stalin. The Yalta axiom dictated that if the Soviets were behaving aggressively in Poland, it was likely a misunderstanding caused by Western suspicion. Their advice was consistent with the last 4 years: smile, concede, and keep the alliance alive. They wanted Truman to follow the script Roosevelt had never written down. But Truman had spent his nights reading the raw files. He saw the Red Army arresting 16 Polish underground leaders who had been invited to Moscow for talks. He saw the installation of a communist puppet regime in Warsaw. He didn't see a misunderstanding, he saw a shakedown. On the morning of the 23rd, Truman convened a special meeting of his top advisors, both the official cabinet and the shadow holdovers. The room was divided. Secretary of War Stimson and General Marshall cautioned that the U.S. still needed Soviet help to fight Japan. They were pragmatic, but the Roosevelt political appointees were terrified of breaking the spirit of the alliance. Truman listened, his face unreadable behind his thick glasses. Then, the man from Missouri stood up. He told them bluntly that their agreements with the Soviet Union had so far been a one-way street. He declared, If the Russians did not wish to join us, they could go to hell. The shadow government was stunned. This was heresy against the Roosevelt doctrine, but the decision was made. At 5:30 p.m., Molotov entered the Oval Office. He expected the usual diplomatic pleasantries, the vague, aristocratically polite language of FDR. Instead, he walked into a buzzsaw. Truman did not offer warm reminiscences. He stood at his desk, jaw set, and immediately launched into a tirade. He accused the Soviet Union of breaking the Yalta Accords regarding Poland. He demanded that the Soviets hold free elections as promised. He stripped away all diplomatic gloss, speaking to the second most powerful man in the communist world as if he were a corrupt precinct captain in Kansas City who had skimmed the pot. Molotov, pale and shaking with genuine shock, stammered, "I have never been talked to like that in my life." Truman didn't blink. "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." When Molotov stormed out of the office, the air in the White House had fundamentally changed. The Roosevelt loyalists were aghast, convinced that this accidental president had just blundered into World War III. Leahy, however, smiled. The ambiguity was gone. Truman had shattered the delicate, unspoken web of personal accommodations that the shadow government had spent years weaving. He proved in 20 minutes that the imperial presidency of secret handshakes was dead. The Oval Office was open for business, and the currency was no longer charm, it was hard power. The confrontation with Molotov was the diplomatic signal. What followed was the administrative execution. Truman realized that he could not govern with a cabinet that looked past him to a ghost. The secret cabinet, the overlapping circles of friends, intellectuals, and unofficial envoys, had to be dismantled. In July 1945, just before departing for the final wartime conference at Potsdam, Truman initiated the most ruthless housekeeping operation in the history of the presidency. He didn't fire them with malice, he fired them with efficiency. The first major domino was the handsome, ineffective Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius. Stettinius had been the perfect foil for Roosevelt's personal diplomacy, a man who looked the part but held no power. Truman needed a heavyweight. He asked for Stettinius's resignation and replaced him with James F. Byans, a sharp-tongued South Carolina politician and Truman's former mentor. Byans was a man who read the fine print. The era of the State Department, being the last to know, was over. Then came the Treasury. Henry Morgenthau Jr., secure in his belief that he was the keeper of the Roosevelt flame, marched into the Oval Office to demand that Truman publicly reaffirm the Morgenthau Plan for Germany. He threatened that if he didn't get his way, he would resign. It was a bluff Roosevelt would have massaged with charm. Truman simply looked at him and said, "I accept your resignation." Morgenthau was stunned. In seconds, the architect of the agrarian Germany policy was out, and the secret cabinet lost its strongest ideological pillar. One by one, the New Dealers fell. Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor and the moral conscience of the administration, departed. The Attorney General followed. Within weeks, the chaotic, brilliant, informal court of Franklin Roosevelt was replaced by a rigid hierarchy of Missouri cronies, hard-nosed lawyers, and professional administrators. The Palace Guard was evicted from the West Wing. The map room was brought under strict military protocol. The back channels were cut. By the time Truman boarded the USS Augusta for Europe in July, the shadow government had been erased. He was no longer caretaker, he was the boss. But as the ship cut through the Atlantic waves, the man from Missouri carried a terrifying new secret in his pocket, a final telegram from the New Mexico desert. The test was successful. The shadow government was gone, but the shadow weapon, the thing they had built in the dark, was now live. And it was entirely up to Truman to decide if the world would burn. July 17, 1945, Potsdam, Germany, the Cecilienhof Palace. Harry Truman walked into the conference room and sat down in the heavy oak chair that had been reserved for the President of the United States. Across the table sat Joseph Stalin, the man the shadow government had tried to charm for 4 years. To his right sat Winston Churchill, the Victorian bulldog who had been the other half of Roosevelt's soul. But the ghost of FDR was finally gone from the room. Truman was not there to charm, he was there to close the books on the Second World War. The change in the American posture was palpable. Churchill noted it immediately. He whispered to his aides that Truman, who had been tentative and humble only weeks before, was now bossing the whole meeting. The reason for this sudden swagger lay in a coded telegram Truman had received just hours earlier. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. It meant the Trinity test in New Mexico was a success. The United States possessed the atomic bomb. The shadow government of the Roosevelt era had relied on the hope that Soviet cooperation would secure the peace. Truman now had a substitute for hope. He had the ultimate stick. The dynamic of the conference shifted from negotiation to dictation. Truman didn't need to beg Stalin for help against Japan anymore. In fact, he now feared a Soviet entry into the Pacific War more than he desired it. The strategic calculus that had driven the Yalta axiom, the idea that the Allies were desperate for Soviet manpower, evaporated in the heat of the atomic flash. On July 24, Truman made his move. It was casual, almost undramatic, a stark contrast to the theatrical secrecy of the Roosevelt years. During a break in the proceedings, Truman wandered over to Stalin. He did not ask for a private audience. He did not use a back-channel envoy like Harry Hopkins. He simply told the Soviet dictator that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He watched Stalin's face closely. The dictator did not blink, did not ask for details, and showed no surprise. He simply replied that he hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman realized then what the intelligence files had hinted at. The shadow government hadn't just been hiding the bomb from Truman, they had failed to hide it from Stalin. The Soviets had spies inside the Manhattan Project. The game of secret friendships had been a delusion. The Cold War had already begun, and Truman, stripping away the romance of the alliance, was finally playing the cards face up. From Potsdam, the orders flowed with terrifying clarity. There was no agonizing, no Hamlet-like indecision that characterized the intellectuals of the New Deal. Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. He did not view it as a philosophical crisis. He viewed it as a military necessity to end the war and check Soviet expansion. When the Enola Gay dropped the little boy on Hiroshima on August 6, it didn't just obliterate a city, it obliterated the Roosevelt way of war. The era of the secret cabinet, managing global affairs through whispers, was replaced by the era of atomic diplomacy, loud, absolute, and terrifyingly clear. When Harry Truman returned to Washington in the late summer of 1945, the victory parades were marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, but the internal revolution was just being finalized. The shadow government of Franklin Roosevelt, that chaotic, brilliant, personalized web of intellectuals and envoys, was dead. In its place, Truman began to construct something far more permanent, colder, and terrifyingly efficient, the modern national security state. Truman had learned a brutal lesson during his first 82 days of blindness. He realized that the safety of the United States could no longer depend on whether the president had a smart friend sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom. Intelligence and strategy had to be institutionalized. He moved to replace the erratic brilliance of the palace guard with the rigid machinery of professionals. The transformation was systemic. The loose collection of spy networks, including the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which had operated like a cowboy outfit during the war, was initially disbanded, only to be reborn as the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Truman wanted a daily intelligence digest, a newspaper for the president, so that no future leader would ever be as blind as he was on April 12. He stripped the Treasury Department of its foreign policy powers, locking diplomacy firmly within the State Department. He moved to unify the warring branches of the military, the Army and Navy, whose rivalries Roosevelt had stoked, into a single Department of Defense. The result was the end of the personal presidency. Under Roosevelt, policy was often what the president felt that morning. Under Truman, policy became a process. The Secret Cabinet was replaced by the National Security Council. The emotional, crusading spirit of the New Deal was purged from American foreign policy, replaced by the grim calculus of containment. The men who had walked the halls with Roosevelt, the dreamers who believed in a global brotherhood with the Soviets and a pastoral Germany, were gone. They were replaced by men like Dean Acheson and George Marshall, realists, cold warriors, and architects of structure. They did not have the warmth of the Roosevelt Circle, but they also didn't have the delusions. By erasing the shadow government overnight, Truman had inoculated the American government against the chaos of the post-war world. He had turned the presidency from a one-man show into a global command center. History often remembers Franklin Roosevelt as the giant and Harry Truman as the caretaker, the little man who merely kept the seat warm. But looking back at the wreckage of 1945, a different truth emerges. Roosevelt was a visionary, a man of unmatched charisma who could juggle empires like tennis balls. But his shadow government, that web of whispers, secret handshakes, and personal fiefdoms, was a system designed for a world that died with him. It relied on the unique genius of one man. When that man died, the system became a suicide pact. Harry Truman, the plain-spoken man from Independence, did the one thing Roosevelt could never bring himself to do. He standardized the power. He didn't erase the Roosevelt legacy out of jealousy. He erased the shadow government because he understood that the United States could no longer survive on charm. The atomic age demanded clarity. It demanded a chain of command that didn't end in a locked drawer or a whispered conversation in a bedroom. By dismantling the court of the palace guard, Truman traded the romance of the war for the stability of the peace. He replaced the intuitive genius of the few with the institutional strength of the many. It was a cold, often cruel transition. Loyal men were discarded. Dreams of a friendly Soviet Union were shattered. But in doing so, Truman saved the presidency from collapsing under its own weight. He walked out of the shadow of the giant, not by trying to fill his shoes, but by building a completely new foundation. When the dust settled, the secrets were no longer hidden in a chaotic cabinet. They were locked in the vault of a superpower, guarded by a system that would fight the Cold War for the next 40 years. The shadow was gone. The state remained.